Morning, everybody. I want to thank the four panelists for four very interesting papers. I'm going to try to say some general things about the topics and arguments that they raise, and then a few short points about each, because I want to leave time for discussion by you in the time we have remaining. We have until noon, right?
Yes.
Until 12 o'clock.
We have 20 minutes.
Okay. The Russian language and the Russian literary milieu is not the only one that has produced the phenomenon of Tamizdat. And I think it might be both interesting and perhaps a little bit freeing to remember that there are other historical examples of this. One of the most significant and best researched is that of France under the old regime, where a very lively and profitable publishing business emerged both in Switzerland and Holland, whose task it was to produce texts in French, publish texts in French that were then imported into France in the underground. And of course, the great scholar of this is Robert Darnton, whose book, The Business of Enlightenment, traces both the content and the networks through which these texts were smuggled back into the old regime. And there are a number of aspects of that project of Darnton's that I think could be useful to pose new questions or revisit old questions in the context that we're interested in here, which is the Russian Tamizdat. One of those agendas, as the title of his book implies, is that Tamizdat was, among many other things, a business. Anne Komaromi has done, I think, as much as anybody to get us to take seriously the material history of the texts of Samizdat. And I think we can see the beginnings of a parallel approach in this conference to the texts of Tamizdat. But there's another material question that I think ought to be asked about this entire enterprise, and that is, follow the money. How were these things financed? What were the models of production that made this textual universe, this parallel textual universe, possible? Are we dealing with a phenomenon that is in one way or another about patronage that is produced at the expense or with the financial help of individuals? We know that that was true, for example, of Chalitze Publications in New York, which was subsidized by Ed Klein, a businessman who had a personal and lifelong passion for the world of the Russian intelligentsia and its products. Or should we be thinking of these Tamizdat publication institutions as variations on the NGO, unofficial organizations that operate outside the orbit of the state but are circulating their products, their texts, their ideas, not just nationally but transnationally? Or are some of these operations actual businesses? Could people make profit by publishing Tamizdat works? Is one version of the patronage model that of the covert patronage of the state? And of course, there are multiple examples of Tamizdat publications that we know benefited from financing by the CIA. Anne has pointed out the role of the Israeli Nativ, which unfortunately remains fairly obscure even now because those archives have not been opened, just selective leaking of documents. There's good evidence that the West German intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, had a hand in subsidizing Pasiev and other Tamizdat publications. So the material history of the production process itself, I think, is wide open. And I'd be interested to hear whatever insights the panelists might have to say about that dimension of the work. When you ask the follow the money question and look at Tamizdat as potentially a form of business, I think you are forced to ask a subsidiary question which has lurked below the surface in today's panel and I think came up briefly yesterday, and I second Philip's recommendation that we get the theoretical issues out on the table. So I'm going to put one approach to this issue, which I do for heuristic purposes. I'm not sure I fully believe it myself, but I thought it would be useful to get it out there for discussion. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think a consensus has emerged that Tamizdat was a technique of reproducing texts. It is impossible to generalize about Tamizdat as a genre, as a politics, as a worldview, because of the extraordinary diversity of products that come to light under the rubric of Tamizdat. Anne Komarami has also shown how the argument of an evolution from literary to political content also cannot withstand scrutiny. That no such generalization really holds water if you cast the net wide enough to include the true diversity and pluralism of the world that was Tamizdat. I think we need to ask ourselves the question of whether the same thing was true of Tamizdat, whether the variety of genre, content, worldview, theme, topic is so great that the only thing we can say about Tamizdat by way of generalization is that it was a technique of textual reproduction, within which an almost limitless range of possibilities came to the surface. Forgive me the following analogy, but terrorism is a technique of violence. It's a particular technique in the larger spectrum of violent practices. Terrorism cannot be exclusively associated with a certain politics or a certain worldview. It is a technique. And that's the question I want to pose about Tamizdat. Is it, at the end of the day, a technique rather than something more specific? Okay, let me make my way very quickly through the four presentations. And I will not be able to do justice to them, and I'm not trying to do justice to them as wholes. I'm just trying to follow up on these general issues as they weave their way through the four presentations. So Philip has this very interesting argument about the way syntaxis reveals what he calls the structural dependency on the Soviet state of the émigré culture that it either reflected or shaped or both. And he borrows this sense from Rozanova herself. I would like to ask, was she right? Is it really accurate or useful to say that this was a condition of structural dependency, that the Soviet system was in their DNA, as he quotes another figure in his paper? This is, of course, a variation on Sergei Ushakin's mimicry argument, that there's a kind of structural parallel or dependency that émigré culture is, whether it means to be doing it or not, is replicating patterns that it came from. So on the one hand, this is completely unsurprising. I mean, these people were born and raised and completely formed by the Soviet system. It's not as if we should have expected them to have created a publishing world that would have been as if from another planet, or as if they would have immediately adopted the practices of their counterparts in Paris. But I want to say that I think it's not just less surprising than it may seem, but I want to suggest it's kind of a subtle shift in the way the model is presented. What I see happening here is not so much a replication or a pattern of dependency, but simply the fact that Soviet culture itself, in its home territory, contains this element of nonconformity as a structural part of its being. So it's not just a mirroring or a mimicry, it's that this particular orthodoxy, the Soviet orthodoxy, like all orthodoxies, generates its own heresies. So those heresies are not mimicking the orthodoxy, they are part of the structure of the orthodoxy itself. It's already embedded even before people leave the Soviet Union. When some of Philip's protagonists, and this also applies to some of the other papers, invoke what they call the literary process, which is this wonderful sense that Soviet or Russian culture is a kind of an evolutionary species that goes through phases collectively. I wonder whether they thought that they themselves were part of the single literary process whose homeland was Russia, or whether there could be multiple Russian language, Russian inflected literary processes that were not necessarily organically tied to each other. In Irina's paper, she too emphasizes, and I found this very helpful, just the sheer diversity within the genre of Tamizdat. Different genres, different subjects, different political orientations, But what I think is most helpful in her presentation is that she then maps that argument about diversity, a sort of category-defying diversity, onto the readership of Tamizdat, looking at the social variety of people who were plugged into these various networks, from Soviet officials, members of the Writers' Union, people who had access to literature coming from abroad in their official capacities, to a very different set of social locations within Soviet society. I do think that the networks that she describes using the examples of these two families with whom she's done the interviews did extend well beyond Moscow and Leningrad. I think we should not make the mistake of thinking of these as predominantly phenomena of the two capitals. I say this based on my research with so-called Дело 24, which was case 24, which was the KGB's investigation of the Chronicle of Current Events, which was able to show, in its effort to reconstruct the networks of production and consumption of the Chronicle, that every mid to large-sized Soviet city, from Riga to Vladivostok, had people who were contributing to and consuming the Chronicle. And we know of Samizdat lending libraries in Odessa and other cities where the circulation of these texts, and I assume that included Tamizdat as well, was an open secret. So I think we're actually dealing with networks that are far more wide-ranging than just Moscow and Leningrad. She mentions that Tamizdat publications were not sold. And this gets me back to the whole question of Tamizdat as a business. Are there transactions happening here? Is there profit being made? I don't know the answer to this. Certainly in the case of Samizdat, an image has emerged in which the circulation of Samizdat text was the most socialist of practices in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That is, even more than the official circulation of books. There were no prices, there was no buying, there was no selling. This was simply the free giving of products. Well, it's not entirely true. We know that there were black markets of Samizdat texts, certainly in Moscow, where people did pay top ruble, so to say, for the most desired text. We know that the lending library in Odessa, about which information is preserved in the Bremen archive at the Forschungsstelle Osteuropa, that they had a fee for, it was a lending library with a fee. So this is not entirely emancipated from the exchange of money. But it would be interesting to know much more about that as regards Tamizdat publications. Anne's paper has a very moving section devoted to these essays by Venzlova, in which she describes the mission as constructing a kind of unity and integrity, by which I think she means a moral unity and a moral integrity in the subject of Tamizdat. If that's the case, that would certainly argue against what I'm proposing is this boundaryless, genreless, topicless, or multi-topic landscape of Tamizdat. That is, I'm suggesting that it's nothing more than a technique of textual reproduction. Her paper seems to be gesturing towards the idea that there is some kind of goal or mission involved, at least on the part of certain authors and perhaps certain readers. And this issue is raised, I think, with heightened clarity in Ilya's paper, where he explores the contrast between the anthology and the almanac as genres whose job it is to capture some or all of the landscape of Tamizdat. And here we're dealing with competing agendas of canonicity versus pluralism, pluralism being the deliberate cultivation of multiple diverse points of view. He quotes Lev Losev memorably saying that the goal is not to collect the best, but to collect everything. For me, the most memorable part of Ilya's paper is that extraordinary letter or sermon, I guess, by Kuzminsky, in which he describes a model of intellectual property or propertylessness that to me just brought back the image of the Russian peasantry in the 19th century, this notion that those who memorize, internalize, digest poetry are, in a sense, now co-owners of that poetry, and that the concept of intellectual property by the author is severely diluted and compromised. I say this reminds me of the Russian peasantry because the Russian peasantry's notion of property ownership was that the land belongs to those who work it, not those who have formal title to the land. So this again gets us back to the question of whether we are dealing with an essentially socialist economy of free distribution in which the question of ownership has been dissolved into some kind of collective owner by the consumers, or whether we can still maintain that this was, after all, a business with its own material history. Thank you.
So I think maybe we can ask our panelists to respond to the discussant and then open the floor for more questions. So.
Okay, I'll very. Oh, okay. Let's see. It's the challenging one. Is this one maybe dead? Oh, you press it, you hold it. Ah, hello. Hello. No. Hello. No, there we go. Very briefly, thank you so much, Ben. These were very insightful and thought-provoking comments, as always. So I really appreciated the part about the business model, and I think it's also connected to your other question that you had to me. And do we believe that this is ultimately really how it was? I don't know, in terms of that structural dependency and that sort of habitus. But I think, at least in this specific context, it was that way in her practice, and it needed to be that way on a local level. On a global level, we don't have to buy into that. There were so many periodicals alone. We haven't talked much about periodicals, but Tamizdat periodicals that appeared in the late 70s were many, and the approaches are varied. But I think here's what she needed it for. Because she had this literary production that was ultimately directly connected to her other kind of artistic and crafts approaches, and we discussed this yesterday. She made her own clothes, and told me yesterday she made her own jewelry, and this rooted back to already the Soviet 60s, and this idea of DIY and artisanal craft that is kind of incorporated in these books and in her practice, and that somehow directly comes from a Soviet mode of cultural production that also required this structure to be embedded in her work, as far as I understand. So maybe I'll leave it to that.
So thank you so much for your comments. I agree. I do think that where is the money coming from and where is it going is one of the most interesting questions. So I'll also be brief. And here I can just say, no one mentioned to me exchange of money except in one particular case, right, in which actual money exchanged hands for a Tamizdat publication. And I wondered at the time if this just goes back to several things. A, how people are getting the books, right, if they're getting them from people who have access to foreign journalists, to material that's being brought in large quantities. These people don't necessarily need to sell the books, right? They can afford to give them away. And then secondly, that they continue to circulate, right? That they just keep being passed on from person to person. So it's not that you necessarily own the particular book. And although I will say that although I didn't come across money, I did come across exchange. So you can bargain. If you have 4 copies of the Gulag Archipelago, but you'd really like something that somebody else has, you can negotiate some sort of exchange of literature for that. And that seems to have been fairly common. But this question of actual money, I did not encounter.
All right. Does this one work?
Mm-hmm.
Thanks so much, as always, for the thoughtful comments and great questions. I would say, I mean, my impulse is to think that defining Tamizdat as a technique of textual production is right. I would say and distribution, because it's so dependent, and maybe that's implied in production, but the intent and the actual practice of taking things back for readers behind the Iron Curtain seems to be central. I appreciate this comparison, and it's probably one that could be really fruitfully pursued with what Darnton describes in the Enlightenment era and French texts, but I think I would also be inclined to want to define the historical specificity of Tamizdat and see not only what's maybe resonant with other similar examples, but what's specific to this time. And a word I'm not totally comfortable with, totalitarian, but the how is what we're talking about really coming out of particular governmental practices and structures that are characteristic of the Soviet Union in this case. And relative to the argument I wanted to make in my paper and maybe was still sort of struggling to clarify, so I appreciate your comments about it. I think I would want to say that integrity, responsibility, and unity or moral unity isn't something that I would think we would need to define or could define as characteristic of Tamizdat in general. But I would say in any specific case where we want to talk about a work that is aesthetically valuable, and as much as aesthetic value depends on an identification with an individual author and the kind of unity of that author, we have to contend with the other things that brought that work into practice and gave it the social life it did, or that it's useful to think about those things. And similarly, in terms of a moral agenda or any other kind of agenda, if you're talking about Bibliotheca Aliyah sending in works where they want to cultivate a new kind of Jewish and Zionist consciousness, that happens, and the unity of an individual who then follows through on that developed consciousness is something that happens as a result of various agendas and agencies that overlap, and sometimes not totally comfortably. So what's defined as kosher still depends on the Soviet authorities and what they think or want, and can be in competition as an individual activist sees it and as people, part of the Nativ Bureau see it. So and I think this is not really like Vyanslava. I'm not looking for a collective unity, moral or otherwise, but just thinking about how we even get to that point when we want to in any particular given case.
Thank you very much, Ben, for emphasizing the role of economics and logistics in case of Samizdat and Tamizdat. I find it extremely important. As for the Blue Lagoon, it was definitely not business. Kuzminsky was a great man to spend money, but not to make them. According to his archive, we have a possibility to look at the letters between him and his editor, Glendening, his publisher, and we clearly see that the money Kuzminsky became for each volume didn't cover actually the costs for making copies, because he and his wife, Emma, who is a professional architect and designer, they made the whole layout all copying by themselves, and Kuzminsky only in the first year of his American life was able to get possibility of free copies at the university in Austin. As for the model of such economics or politics, Kuzminsky was very fond of anarchy movement, and it was not just artistic role, but he seriously tried to copy different kinds of social practices of Russian anarchism, especially in his New York period, in different incarnations of his Podval Club. He got money for different books he edited there and sell them. and although we see on the books that there are only 10 pieces of each volume, his archive shows clearly that it was far much more, but the money didn't either played any serious role in his activity as an editor or Kulturträger.
Right, well, we have basically supposed to go and have coffee, but maybe we can have some questions instead. Yeah, well, for a little while.
Ilya, I don't know, I probably should mention this context, and I don't know if it's to be true, but Kuzminsky always claimed that the copyright issues actually what brought, what stopped publication of Blue Lagoon. I'm referring to Arkady Lvov lawsuit. Probably, did you find the research that this actually was true? That this is actually
Yes.
stopped it, or was it just intensely historical?
Not really. This issue with Lvov is interesting. The only thing which Glendening wrote about in his own memoirs about the Blue Lagoon, I've bought his book, and there are only 2 pages about his cooperation with Kuzminsky, and 1 page is this case of Lvov. Kuzminsky published the photography of the nude Lvov in the last volume of the Blue Lagoon, and it was a huge process against the publishing house and Kuzminsky himself, which could be avoided. The real purpose or why did this project stop was that in 78, 88, there were really enough possibilities in the Soviet Union to publish things which Kuzminsky wanted to do himself. He wanted to publish 3 volumes on Moscow poetry. There is, for example, the Leningrad volume, Kharkov volume, but not Moscow volume. And Kuzminsky saw clearly that his editor, his publisher, will not do it anymore because it has no sense at all.
Right. And one more question. Did you find in your research evidence of a project called Универсальная барака or Последняя барака, which is last attempt at anthology project from the 96-97?
There are a lot of mentions of it, but not the book itself. I'm not sure that Kuzminsky did it.
They have a question.
Actually, 2 comments. As far I think the business aspect of it all, or the economic aspect, is really important. And as far as kind of Tamizdat, Edward Limonov in Moscow, before emigrating, he would sell his poetry, kept retyping his poetry, and he would sell it for 5 rubles, a little booklet. So this was, you know, the beginning of the business for one particular. And as far as, I'm sorry, I missed your talk, but as far as Rozanova and Sinyavsky, I knew them quite well. I stayed in their house many times. And their business sense, or her business sense, was, at least from my perspective, kind of lacking. And from their son's perspective. I remember, you know, it was a 3-story house, and all of the stairs were filled with their books. They did not distribute well. She did not open letters. I remember once at breakfast, the son was there and chastising his parents. God, you've got to open these letters. These are bills and blah, 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 and so on. So, yeah, as far as business went at their place, it was amazing how unbusinesslike.
Other questions?
Unbusiness-minded, yeah.
Yasha?
Well, not really a question, but perhaps there is a big difference between the different periods that we are talking about. My feeling is that the earlier Tamizdat period, the 60s, is much more businesslike. And
Tamizdat.
And of course, it is also much more profusely funded by CIA and such organizations. While when the aesthetic mission of Tamizdat prevails later on in the 70s, the business part goes to the background. That seems to be the pattern, but of course it's much more individual and it's hard to generalize.
Any questions, comments?
I have one comment because I lived with Tamizdat and Tamizdat all my student years went on in an apartment that was so full of it that there was a dangerous aspect to it. I remember that when my first husband was stopped in Moscow subway and arrested, my mother-in-law came and we collected Tamizdat in 2 suitcases and carried it to the roof. And it turned out that he was, traveling late. They were closing subway, Moscow metro at 1 o'clock, and he simply had an argument with a cop. But that was the atmosphere of that time, basically,
Yes, and this is something that I don't think has been really mentioned too much, or maybe not at all, that this is, except when Landea talked, that it was a very dangerous activity to be engaging in, and these people were super brave. So I don't know how it would contribute to your scheme, theoretical scheme, but there is also that involved, definitely, and for not very much money. So if you're speaking about moral side of this, there must have been motivation to be risking everything. No?
For sure.
Self-evident but not expressed, right?
More than one moral motivation.
More than one.
That was my point. Yeah.
Possibly not even moral ones.
Musician. Yes.
Well, what kind then? Political? What kind? What kind of a motivation? Is there a shared motivation, or everybody had their own motivation?
If you're asking me, I think there were certainly overlaps, but the political spectrum of views represented in these textual worlds is very, very large. And moral motivations are a little bit more difficult to tease out, but I would guess that there was a great variety there too. But I think your basic point is stands on its own merits, that it was dangerous. The stakes involved were quite high, and most people sought to avoid that risk if they were even interested in the material to begin with.
I probably could add something because it was probably youthful rebellion and hatred for the regime, and a part of it was that young people are more sort of careless in a way and more rebellious, and because I grew up in Lithuania, I was more so. I was not as frightened as my Moscow, friends. I studied in Moscow. But when somebody approaches you, like my first husband, the pickup line was, could they reprint Brodsky's poems? I had no idea who he was. So there was a possibility he was a pickup line, and there was a possibility that he was a Stukach, he was a KGB guy, because we had those at the university too. I didn't think that just because I was young and stupid. I was 19 years old.
I think it's time for some coffee.